Can't stop thinking about food? You might be thinking, I can't keep any of my favorite foods in the house, otherwise I'm going to just raid the pantry and finish it all. If that sounds like you, that sounds like nearly every single client I've ever worked with. In this video, we're gonna break down the 3 reasons why you can't stop obsessing and thinking about food. Because it is time for you, Bliss Seeker, to get your power back. This is the most underrated symptom of hunger, right? It is a survival mechanism. Think of your brain trying to be extra diligent because it really wants to make sure it can find something to eat. So if you think about food, you're more likely to then suss out where the potential food can be located to make sure your body isn't famished. So you have this tiny little pea-sized part in your brain called the hypothalamus. And its main function, it's like the CEO of survival. Basically, it maintains what we call homeostasis. And this is really the balance to keep everything in check so that you are well and survive. And ultimately, it regulates things like blood pressure, your heart rate, your blood oxygen and CO2 levels, blood sugar levels, as well as hormones, including hunger and appetite. So what we can anticipate is our pupils dilate, our heart rate starts beating a bit more, perhaps we have more obsessive thoughts. We might be detecting for more potential threat in our environment, right? Our body can't really know the difference between caveman times or cavewomen times, and ultimately doesn't know that we have food available around us. So the threat in this case is not having enough food. And so what may happen is that we start thinking about food. Maybe we start preparing to eat. The body's really trying to get you to hunt in your environment to find something to eat. Hence why we can't stop thinking about it. So meeting our biological needs is going to be the first step in making sure and reducing those obsessive thoughts around food. Let's take a look at a landmark study that really highlights this. And this study is known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, done in 1945. This was a grueling study that meant to gain insight on the physical and physiological effects of semi-starvation post-World War. During the experiment, participants were subjected to semi-starvation where they had to lose 25% of their body weight. Many experienced anemia, fatigue, apathy, extreme weakness, irritability, neurological deficits, and lower extremity edema, which is inflammation. Now, what was really interesting was the psychological impact that starvation had on them. They quite literally became food obsessed. And the most interesting part is that that effect of being undernourished actually lasted up to 5 months after re-nourishing, because of course they had to regain the weight for health reasons. So I want you to think of 2 things to help you make sure you're meeting your biological needs. The first is adequacy. Making sure that you're eating enough at mealtime and snack time. And the second is frequency. Frequency means making sure you're not waiting too long between meals or snacks. Typically, a rule of thumb is not waiting more than 3 to 4 hours between eating occasions. All right, let's look at number 2, which is you are experiencing mental restriction. So we just talked about physical restriction, right? Biological and not necessarily having access or not giving yourself enough physical food. But what happens if we're feeding ourselves adequately, but we're still thinking and obsessing over food? Cue mental restriction. This often happens when we label foods as good or bad. So what we have to do is neutralize them. You might call them cheat foods, bad foods, naughty foods, sinful foods. Let's start using the language of what is, right? So a cookie's a cookie, asparagus is asparagus. They're not good or bad, they just are. What ends up happening when you label foods as bad is that you're more likely to glorify them, right? They're on a pedestal and you're thinking, oh my gosh, chocolate, right? And when that happens, you're giving your power to that food. You might find yourself daydreaming about the foods, thinking about, oh my gosh, imagine having a croissant for breakfast, having a big bowl of pasta, oh my gosh, drool. The interesting part is if you let yourself have it, you're less likely to glorify it, you're more likely to normalize it and stop obsessing. Let's talk about an example. Imagine that I'm craving a chocolate chip cookie, a gooey, melted, warm cookie. And I tell myself I can't have it. You know, that's really bad for me. And so what I do instead is I reach for other snacks to try to distract me and try to fill that void, what we call a phantom food. So imagine I eat an apple, eating it, you know, and then I'm like, still hungry, still craving the chocolate chip cookie. Maybe instead I'm gonna have some rice cakes. Let's do that. Grab the rice cakes, still not cutting it. Okay, maybe I'm gonna try some carrots and hummus. Not cutting it, still daydreaming about the chocolate chip cookie. What ends up happening? Well, frickin' sod it, I'm gonna have the damn cookie. You end up eating way more than you probably would have if you just let yourself have the cookie in the first place. My advice, just eat the damn thing. And number 3, food is your main source of comfort and pleasure. Now let's be really honest with ourselves. Where else are we getting and receiving pleasure or joy in our lives? Let's take inventory, because oftentimes food is a very sensory experience, isn't it? We like that stimulation, the flavor, the warmth, the texture. It gives a lot of comfort, and that's a natural response. It's actually really important for survival. The problem occurs when it becomes our sole source of pleasure and comfort, and therefore we rely on it heavily, and we keep daydreaming about cookies, crisps, pizza, tacos, whatever it is that is comforting for you. Rather, when we find pleasure in other ways, perhaps it's meeting a friend, having at least 20-second hug with a loved one. Maybe it's going outside and spending time in nature. Maybe it's being with your pet or playing at a great tune and just dancing. When we start finding other ways to really get those dopamine levels up, we rely less and less on food and therefore obsess less and less. So start making a list of places and things that give you pleasure in your life. And if it's maybe a bit short, that's okay. There's always room for improvement. What are things that you think might give you pleasure, right? Maybe it's activities you've been wanting to do and you've been putting on the back burner. Maybe it's a delicious book you've been wanting to read. Maybe it's going out with a friend or going on an adventure. Maybe it's just having a self-care day and literally just soaking in the tub and giving yourself more space. Whatever it is, I invite you to really add in those pleasure pops in your days or weeks and see what happens to those obsessive thoughts. So you might be asking, but Ari, what if I'm actually addicted to food? Could that be possible, and do these 3 tips still work for me? Good question. I'm going to be totally honest with you. Are you ready? I might get a lot of hate for this. Food addiction isn't real. Now, what is real is the feeling of being addicted. Absolutely, I empathize and I appreciate that that is possible. However, biologically and physiologically speaking, we cannot be addicted to something we were required to survive. That's like saying I'm addicted to water or I'm addicted to breathing. It cannot happen, as it's actually one of the bases of the hierarchy of needs of humans and all mammals, right? We need to eat. And if we think about the addiction model, it tells us that we need to abstain from whatever it is that we're addicted to. Think alcohol or drug rehabilitation programs. There's no in between. It's either you have it and you're addicted or you don't. That can't really happen with food. We can't just stop eating, right? Hello, we need to survive. The body needs it. Now, what does actually happen is that your reward systems are absolutely heightened and more sensitive when you go long periods without eating. So that makes sense, right? Because the body wants to provide you with a positive feedback loop. It's saying, yes, oh my gosh, when I'm hungry, listen to me. It's positively reinforcing the nourishing activity, right? So naturally, when you're starving and you eat, it's like, oh yes, right? I needed this. You go, girl, you feed yourself. Now, in the research, one of the main methods of evaluating food addiction is by using what they call the Yale Food Addiction Scale. So imagine this being like a questionnaire where you pencil in what symptoms apply to you. And what they have actually found, a review of 60 studies looking at food addiction, found that many of the symptoms of food addiction overlap with eating disorder behaviors. So let me read some of them out. The criteria indicating food addiction may look at things such as preoccupation with food, aka food obsession, eating beyond fullness, avoiding certain foods, unhealthy weight loss practices, eating in secret, avoiding social situations involving food, and guilt after eating. Now, these sound pretty much like what every single one of the clients I work with present with when they come to me. And so we have to start questioning, because let me tell you, as soon as we start really addressing the root cause, it's never really about addiction. It's not physiological. There's no lack in chemistry. It's very much typically coming from a source of deprivation. And so when we look at the Yale Food Addiction Scale, many of the criteria actually overlap with binge eating, which is triggered most often. Number one predictor of binge eating is restriction and not eating enough, or not giving yourself permission to have the foods you actually want to have. So I hope this breaks down the biology, the science of what might be going on if you're feeling food obsessed. So try these 3 things and let me know in the comments what you think. Now, if you like this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the little bell to be reminded the next time I drop a video every single week. And if you're looking to get started with your food and body healing journey, I've created a free audio guide to help you break up with diets once and for all and find freedom, bliss, and your authentic self. So you can find that here or in the description below, and I will see you next time.